He's a multi-talented presenter. I've seen his presentations, he's wonderful, very knowledgeable about our culture, very respectful of our culture. So I will give you Jamie Jacobs.
So I'm going to wear these things in my ears for the recording. So if I can't hear anybody or hear anything, just wave your hands and I'll do my best. Is it on there? Can you hear it? Yeah.
It's connected.
Okay, sounds good. I just want to first of all say Yahweh for inviting me here tonight. Talking about history is something that has become quite a passion of mine over the years, which is very ironic because in high school I didn't really pay attention to history. I did everything I could to get out of history class and didn't really pay attention too much. What I did pay attention to quite a bit though growing up at Tonawanda was the culture. And a lot of that just had to do with the fact that I was pretty much born and raised, you know, in the down below part of the reservation. And living in that part of the reservation, I spent a lot of time with my mother's parents and my father's grandparents. So they were faith keepers at our longhouse in Tonawanda. My father's grandparents spoke Seneca. They were first language speakers. You may have heard of my great-grandmother. Her name was Esther Sundown. She was very knowledgeable. Her father was a chief, her grandfather was a chief, and her grandmother was a clan mother. So being exposed to them, I never really thought at that time, and it wasn't even really a plan of mine to kind of, you know, delve into like the historical and, you know, oral tradition and the culture and even ceremonies at that time. It's just something that I had kind of stepped into later on in my life. So growing up with my mother's parents, I was always at the longhouse. I was always, you know, running around and, you know, doing, you know, things that I probably shouldn't have been doing, getting into trouble. But to be there, especially at that time, so this is like the, you know, the 80s and the 90s, right? We had a lot of elders still left at that time. I remember Corpus Sundown was still alive, you know, partaking in ceremonies as a kid. So at that time, you know, it wasn't really a thing to, you know, sit down in a room like this and have cultural presentations and classes and language programs even. You know, Tonawanda didn't even have a language program up until just a few years ago. So when I graduated high school in 2000, and then even then, my goal in life at that time when I was 18 was to, you know, move off the reservation. That teaching of, you know, the American dream was in my head at the time, you know, because that's what was told to us in high school and growing up. So I had moved out to Arizona and when I graduated high school. And at that time, my goal in life was to be a Harley-Davidson mechanic. So I went to the Harley-Davidson school and I graduated, you know, with as much programming as I could from there, and that's what I wanted to do. And my plan at that time was to not come home, was to graduate school and then just go and find a job and then go right to that job. But being out there at 19 years old, 2,000 miles away from home, I really missed that sense of community and family, and that's what really brought me home. So when I came home, I did work in that profession for a few years, but then what happened was in 2006, I was asked to apply for a job in the city of Rochester at this place called the Rochester Museum and Science Center. So sitting with Esther, she had this little house, it was very small. And it was, you know, pretty much down the one end of the reserve where not a lot of people lived, so it's pretty quiet. So I used to sit with her after her husband passed away, just to kind of keep her company. And that's kind of when we started talking about like culture and history, and like I start kind of thinking about the language a lot more. So she used to talk about her grandmother. So her grandmother was Julia Blacksquirrel, and she used to tell two stories about her like all the time. You know how elders kind of have like those repetitive stories they tell? Well, one story that she would tell me all the time was about her grandmother Julia, and how her and the other older women who were basket makers would pick a day where they would just sit in a circle and make baskets. And they would put all the babies inside the circle. And because Esther was the oldest one at the time, Julia would put her in charge of taking care of the kids inside the circle so that they could sit in the circle and make baskets. So she says, like, hearing that talk back and forth, because she said this was something they did all the time. That was really profound to me, because one, I never had the chance to ever meet Julia. I didn't know what she looked like, but just hearing that story really got me intrigued about family history. So you have to remember, though, this is the early 2000s, and the internet was kind of like a new thing. So by chance, at the same time I was going to college, I went back to school, and I had typed Julia Black into the internet. So what had happened was, when I got the results, when I put it in the internet, it came back that Julia Black was associated with the Rochester Museum and Science Center. And at that time, I had no idea why, and I had no idea as to how this museum could be associated with somebody even I never met. So I went on their website, and you know how like they always have like just this arbitrary email that you can send any kind of inquiries? So that's what I did. And I had asked about Julia Black. Well, I never got a reply in my email. So 3 months later, I went and attended this dinner that we were having at our college that I was going to at the time. And I noticed that one of our elders was sitting with this non-native woman. So at the end of the dinner, the elder come over and introduced me to this non-native woman. And the non-native woman said, "I am a registrar at the Rochester Museum and Science Center." So I just thought, wow, this is quite a coincidence, because I sent you an email 3 months ago and I never heard anything. So she says, well, we don't always check the email, and the email never makes it to the right department, so I apologize. So she says, what were you asking about? So I said, well, I was inquiring about my great-grandmother, Julia Blacksquirrel. So her eyes got really big, and she says, oh, I know all about Julia. So I thought, what does this non-native woman know anything about my great-grandmother? I said, that's really odd. So she says, well, why don't you just go to the museum? She goes, and I'll show you. So I went, and I was just blown away that when I walked into this room, there were these shelves that were just full of all of these things that I could recognize. Baskets, beadwork, everything you can think of, wood carvings, rattles, drums, all of those things. So she showed me this one shelf that was just full of baskets. And she said, these are your grandmother Julie's baskets. These are what she made. And I just thought, this is amazing, because the only really story that I have of Julia is sitting with elders in a circle making baskets. And then my great-grandmother telling me the story, and I just thought that that was just so amazing. So at the time, she says, well, the museum wants to repatriate items back to your community. So in 1990, there was a law that was passed simply stating that any institution that receives any kind of grant funding, federal funding, municipal funding, they have to notify the communities in which they have material that originate from those communities so that they could be returned. So what's also coincidental is that in 1996, when the chiefs and the faith keepers were negotiating with some of these museums, I actually went along just as a young observer. So my dad had worked with one of the chiefs, and one of the chiefs said, "Hey, I want to take your son to this meeting. I think it'll be beneficial." And because my dad said, "You're gonna go," I went without even knowing or even interested in what was gonna be talked about. So I kind of was familiar with what she was introducing me to in 2006, was the idea of NAGPRA, repatriation. So I was very excited, and she had asked me to apply for this position that they were looking to hire somebody to help identify some of the objects, let them know what they are, but also just help with the paperwork and time and things that the museum would be doing, investing into returning some of our sacred items. So being there in 2006, the grant was for 3 years, which was also nice for me because I was still in college. So I could work at the museum, and then I could finish school, and it just really worked out that way. So I was going to school to be a New York State environmental police officer. That's what I wanted to do then, because right off Tonawanda, there's a game preserve, called the Tonawanda Iroquois Wildlife Refuge. And at the time, they were really looking for natives. So I just thought, okay, well, this is an opportunity. I think I should take it. So I was really vested in that at the time. So when the grant funding was coming up to its end at the museum, they said, well, we're looking for somebody to keep on staff to help curate or take care of the Iroquoian collections. So she says, I think that you should apply, and that that'll give you a permanent position here. So I was very excited. I applied and I got the job. So that was 2009, and the job at that time was to be an assistant to George Hamill, who was going to be taking care of this collection called the Rock Foundation. So when I viewed this collection, they took me in a room, and I seen all of these things that, as a Seneca growing up in Tonawanda in 1980, 1990, there were things in there that I just could not identify. And there were things in there that I had no idea what they were. I had no idea how old they were. And even some of the symbolism that were engraved and etched into some of these objects, I, at that time, as a Seneca, could not tell you what those things were because I just had not seen them in the community. And I had not seen them being made in the community. And some of the things I could identify, but I couldn't tell you the story behind them. So my grandmother was still alive, Esther was still alive at the time. So I brought her into the museum with me. And I set up this microphone, and I said, I'm going to show you all these different things. And what I would like is for you to give me the Seneca name, if you can remember, and just tell me a little bit about it, on what you think it is, or what you understand it to be. So I did both. I brought her to the museum, but I also took pictures to her in her living room, and I just showed her the pictures and asked her to do the same thing. So there were a lot of things that I had showed her at the time that she just couldn't really identify, and she had no name for them in the language. So I thought, well, that's okay, because the things I'm showing you are like 4 or 5, 1,000 years old. And we were both okay with that. So we kind of learned together. Because what ended up happening was, instead of just learning words, what happened was that in the mid-2000s, the Tonawanda Longhouse was in a critical situation where we were losing our ceremonial speakers. So we had language speakers, but it's one thing to just speak a language, but it's another to stand up in a crowd and know the structures of these ritual speeches, weddings, funerals, just everyday ceremonies, medicine ceremonies, and things of that nature. So I thought, well, we had the one ceremony one night at our longhouse, and we had a speaker who was speaking for us at the ceremony, and he was pretty old at the time, and he was having a hard time standing and remembering what had to be said. And I could still picture him standing there, and he got silent, and all of a sudden, as we're sitting there in a quiet longhouse, he spoke English, and he said, "I'm having a hard time, and I think now is the time where you young people have to start thinking about taking over these things." So I thought, all right, well, I've been spending a lot of time with my great-grandmother. I've been spending time learning language. Maybe I can do something and help out and do my part. So I learned some of the basics. I learned some of the easier things, started out there. And then as time went on, as I started understanding more language, it just got to the point where I could ask my grandmother questions in the language, and then she would just answer them back. And then it got to the point where we were just having conversations in her living room. So she would teach me ceremonial speeches. And there were times when I would ask her, well, what does this mean? Because she would say, this is what has to be said. And I didn't understand. Even though I understood the language, I didn't understand the contextual meaning of why that word was being used. And historically, she couldn't explain it either. She would just say, well, it's just what has to be said. So I was okay with that. I just, would repeat some of these things because that's what had to be said. But then, working in the museum and seeing some of these objects, and I started to get some of these like light bulbs going off in my head. And then I really started to understand like some of these things, and I started connecting the dots. So where I'm going with this is my presentation to you tonight is my journey on what I call museum archaeology. Meaning that I'm not an archaeologist. I didn't go to school to be an archaeologist. I don't go out and dig things up, and I don't do any of those things. But what I did for the past 17 years working at the museum was I took the oral tradition, I took what I learned from elders, language, and all of the histories that they had passed on, as much as I could get from them. And then I took the objects that I couldn't identify, and what I did was I brought both worlds together as best as I could to bring an understanding to both worlds. Because the archaeologists who could identify these things and tell us the time they came from, they couldn't sit down and explain to you the cultural heritage stories behind them. Only the elders in the language could do that. But at the same time, my grandma Esther could not identify certain objects, but she could identify the language and the ceremonies that these objects could be related to. So when you put those together, you get a very clear understanding, and you get a really awesome story. And I'm going to share some of those discoveries with you tonight. So my Seneca name is Huyat, and as we say in Seneca, I'm Turtle Clan. And I say, I'm a Seneca from Tonawanda. So, for the past 10 years, or I should say before COVID, 10 years before COVID, that's all I did was my grandmother passed away in 2012. So from that time before and then since then, that's all I did was just study like language. And I took certain linguistic classes to even understand like a scientific view of our language and how it's structured. Because I always knew, and the elders always told us, just like the one that I told you about earlier, they always said there's going to be a time when we won't be here and you will have to do it yourself. So what I did was, rather than just write down words and word lists, because it's impossible for any human being to memorize, thousands and thousands of words. So part of the reason I took a scientific approach in addition was because I wanted to know how the language was structured, so that when the elders weren't here, I could go back and change that word to whatever I thought would be appropriate and necessary to change it to, without having the elder do it for me. So doing that, I really got this perspective of the culture that I think a lot of people kind of miss out on. Because our language, the way it's structured, it's very, very poetic, but there's a lot of nuances. Meaning that even though it literally says this, it's describing a whole, different perspective. And again, I'm going to share some of those with you tonight. So, what you're looking at here is an image of the original, what we call Hiawatha belt, right? Everybody can identify it as Seneca, Cayuga, Oneida, Mohawk, and Onondaga. And we know that the symbolism that you see on the wampum belt is describing this unification of the original 5 nations, okay? It's everywhere. It's on the side of our buildings, it's on t-shirts that we wear, and it's on bumper stickers, and everything you can think of, pens, pencils, all of those things. So I thought that I would begin here and kind of give you a different perspective on what this symbol means. Because we all identify ourselves as Haudenosaunee, right? So even though we can say we're Seneca, but we belong to a much bigger confederacy called Haudenosaunee. So, and again, I'm one of these people that just, it doesn't matter if I'm Tonawanda and you're Cattaraugus or Allegheny, we're all Seneca, right? We all came from the same place. It's only as time goes on, colonization takes place, and we have to adapt, and that's when the ancestors decided, well, we're going to go our different ways politically. But nonetheless, we all said, we're still Seneca, no matter what. So, every ancient human ancestor, it doesn't matter who you are, whether you're red, white, black, or yellow, every human ancestor traversed the earth, right, all over the place. And what happens though is that certain groups of people, they settle in one area, and then others go off and settle in a different area. And there's different terms that science like to use to describe the groups. Some are nomadic, right? So what they do is they don't have a permanent place. They follow, the food, the animals, and that's how they sustain their group. So some people just, do that their whole entire lives, generation after generation. They're just nomads, And a lot of times where you see that happen is in the desert, because the desert is just so unpredictable. And then some become hunter-gatherers, right? So they hunt and then they gather, but still they have to be somewhat nomadic because they have to go from one area to another as a hunter-gatherer, because you have to gather what you need here, and then what you may need that's not there, you have to go to a different place and gather it there. Or same thing with animals. So what happens though is that our ancestors, our ancient ancestors, decided that they would add another element onto hunter-gatherer. So can anybody guess in this room what that might be? What did they add to hunting and gathering?
Agriculture.
agriculture. So one of the main reasons that we are able to call ourselves Haudenosaunee in the first place is because our ancestors, our ancient ancestors, decided that they were going to finally learn and teach themselves how to plant. So what that means is that when you do that, you can stay in one area more permanent, okay? You can stay in one area longer, one spot, okay? Because you can grow your own food. Hunting and gathering becomes supplemental to growing food. So our ancient ancestors grew corn, beans, and squash, right? But then on top of that, they still did hunting and gathering. So when they finally decided to add agriculture to this equation, that's when they were able to settle in this area, or what we call the traditional homelands. So the traditional homelands of the Seneca is in the Genesee Valley, or what we call Geneseo, okay? So what happens then is that when you are able to settle in one area longer, what happens? Can anybody guess?
Your society becomes more intricate, politically adept, beautiful orators. The government becomes more complex.
Yeah, but the government's not in place yet because they haven't put in Haudenosaunee.
I'm sorry, your religion, your culture becomes more complex.
That's true, but without a certain thing, culture doesn't thrive either. And what is that? What happens when you settle in one area? It's very basic. What's that? Couldn't hear you.
Family?
Family.
Plan.
Your population gets bigger. And when your population gets bigger, so you have one nation here, and then you have another nation close by. And when your population gets bigger, you have more mouths to feed. And when you have more mouths to feed, your hunting has to expand. Not your planting area, because your planting area you can contain in one spot. But your hunting has to expand when you have more mouths to feed. And when hunting expands, what happens?
Less animals.
Less animals. And then when less animals happens, what happens after that? What do you got to do after that?
Move away.
Move away. But do you move one village, big village? No, you just move your hunters out further and further. But when you move your hunting grounds out further and further, what happens to the people next to you who are doing the same thing? You start coming into conflict. Very good. So when you start coming into conflict, then you start to have the need for social order and government. So we already had local governments in place, but even the local governments or chiefs could not contain the violence that was happening with families. And it came to a point where the chiefs would even endorse violence, because if you're a leader of a village and your village is starving and you need food, you're gonna tell your hunters, you do what you gotta do to bring those animals back, to feed the people. So the chiefs are doing the same thing in the other nation living next to you. So what happens is that when you become engulfed in warfare, your mentality changes. And when your mentality changes, especially those of the warriors, instead of being proud of hunting for animals and providing for your family, you start hunting people, each other. Because in this equation of the food chain is, rather than just spend the time to sit down and negotiate, it's easier just to kill your competition right off the bat, and then you don't have to deal with it at all. And that's what happens. So if you ask some elders, when was the Confederacy established? Some will say 2,000 years ago. And some elders will say about 1,000 years ago. And both answers are right. And the reason why both answers are right is because it most likely would have taken that much time to, one, figure out how to plant, figure out, grow and evolve to plant on a large basis for the village, and then it takes a few generations to get engulfed in that warfare, but it's also going to take a couple generations to settle it down. So when you finally can say, okay, Haudenosaunee starts here, it took all that time to do everything we just discussed through many generations to get to that point, and then you can say Haudenosaunee. So it's about food and resources is why we're able to tell ourselves or call or refer to ourselves as Haudenosaunee. The elders, oftentimes, especially when they're telling this story of what we call the story of the peacemaker, they will often use other terms. You won't really hear them say Haudenosaunee when they're traditionally telling the story of the peacemaker. So the term that they use is they say Ganoshaunee. So when I was studying and attending these traditional condolences where they install a new chief of the Confederacy, I kept hearing that term over and over. So I would go back to my gram and I would say, they're not saying Haudenosaunee, they're saying Ganoshaunee. What does that mean? It sounds the same, and I'm guessing it is the same, but there's a little bit of a difference. So she says, when you say Haudenosaunee, she says, that's the name of us. That's just what we call ourselves. And she says, when you say Ganoshaunee, she says, that's what gets us up to why we call ourselves Haudenosaunee. So I could understand what she was saying, but linguistically, I wanted to know what was saying that rather than Haudenosaunee. And here's the difference. So when you say Haudenosaunee and Ganoshaunee, so one of the differences that you hear is Hudi and then Ga, okay? So Hudi means it to them, okay? So we have two different ways of referring to people in Seneca. I have me as an agent and then me as a patient. So if I'm the one talking to you, I'm the agent. You're the ones who are listening, so you're the patient. So I'm doing the action, you're receiving the action. So even though we're both participating in the same verb of talking, you're receiving and I'm giving. So I'm doing it, and it is being done to you. That's how we differentiate those two ways in Seneca. So if I say Hadi, I'm saying they are doing it. And if I say Hudi, it is being done to them, or it is to them. So Haudenosaunee, so when you say nos, that's the incorporated noun root for the house. And then when you say yoni, that means to extend it, to make it longer. Haudenosaunee. So what you're really saying when you say that is you're saying it to them, the house extended. That's really what you're saying. And the reason why it's it to us is because we don't do it to the house. The house keeps us. So that's why it's Hudi. But when you say Ganoshaunee, you say Ga, which is it. The, nos, house, yoni, extension. But then we have a suffix on the end, and it's pronounced don. And we call that a causative suffix. So when you say Ganoshaunee, what it's saying is it's saying the house was caused to extend. What is the cause? Well, the cause is everything that I had just explained to you. So just that little suffix of don, causative, it was caused. It's not just saying cause, because. What it's implying is that something happened to where the house was forced to expand. And that includes a whole explanation of history, because we know that there's a whole history of why we became Haudenosaunee. First, it starts out because our ancestors decided they were going to learn how to plant. That causes it. And because they learned how to plant, they stayed in one area longer. And when they stayed in one area longer, the population grew. And when the population grew, they needed more resources, especially food. So then they started competing for resources with other nations and even other villages. And then when they started doing that, it became all out warfare and bloodshed. And then that bloodshed and warfare is what led to the coming of the peacemaker. That's the causative. So that's why traditionally, when you hear the peacemaker's journey recited in its original context, you always hear them say Haudenosaunee. So, museum archaeology. When we look at this, we see a symbol, we see colors, we can identify it and say this is the Hiawatha Belt, it represents the Iroquois Confederacy, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy. And that's usually all we say. But what we don't really think about or learn about is, well, what's underneath that? What explanation lies that can tell us more about this? So if you just glance at it, that's what you can read from it. It tells about when the Confederacy was formed. So what we're going to do is we're going to dig deeper, and I'm going to help you identify more about this item that you're looking at. Because at one time this wasn't a museum, and at one time the only way to view it was to get permission from the New York State Museum to walk in and say, I want to look at this. But before that, it was in the hands of our ancestors. And then in 1990, 1991, it made its way back to our community, specifically the Onondaga Nation. Can anybody in the room identify this particular object? It's not a corn husk, but you are right that it is a mat. So it is a mat. Can anybody see, because we already know that it's not corn husk, because a corn husk mat would be braided. Because the corn husk is only this long, sometimes it's this long, and it's not long enough to do a one continuous braid or one continuous weft. So it has to be made of something else. Can anybody identify what it's made of? What is it? You know that because you've already heard my presentation. And you've already heard somewhere where I explained this.
Yeah.
So it is bulrush.
Oh, okay.
It's bulrush. So it's not woven. It's actually twisted and twined together. So this is a bulrush mat, and this is what our ancient ancestors, specifically Haudenosaunee women, is what they would produce, every day for utilitarian use, to sleep on, to put inside the longhouse, to sit on outdoors. But what happens though is that to get bulrush to make these large mats, they had to get them from somewhere else because they don't really grow really tall in our area. So the best bulrushes for Haudenosaunee women would have to go into a different place where it grew much bigger and taller and longer, and either procure it themselves or trade for it. And they did both. So the best bulrushes came from Lower Ontario. So that's why the Senecas expanded that way and then went up to Toronto, because that's where some of the best bulrushes came from. And that's why Senecas occupied the village, which is now known today as Toronto. So they would bring these bulrushes back, and and they would twine them into these mats. So the traditional name of the bulrush in Seneca is we call it ganoda. So as I explained earlier, the way it works in the language is you have an agent prefix, and then you have a patient prefix. So we call the plant itself ganoda. But when we take that plant, process it, and make it into something else, we call that onoda. So the word for the bulrush plant is called ganoda. And the word for whatever we make from it, such as this bulrush mat, we call it onoda. So the same thing exists in other places. So we have a word for porcupine. It's called gaheta. The quill, when we take it off and use it to do quilt work, like I do, we call that quill oheta. Because the agent is the ga, and then the patient is the o, or yo originally, yoheta. But we shorten it and we take off the line. So Haudenosaunee women, this was a cultural practice, and it was essential to the village. So what they would do is they would make smaller versions of this, and they would give it to the men, and then that's what the men carried on their back whenever they left the village and went somewhere for a long period of time. So this term arose from that cultural practice as well. And in Seneca, they say onoda gente. So onoda is the bulrush mat, and gente means to bear it on the back, to carry. So onoda gente. So what happens is when warfare broke out, and the men would empty the village with their warrior society, each one of them carried a bulrush mat. So they would go off to the warpath, wherever it was. We know it was all over the Northeast. And it came to the point where they said, okay, we're gonna call warfare onodagekte. And that's what they called it. Our ancient ancestors, that's what they called warfare. They said onodagekte. Why? Because the men carried out this act of putting the bulrush mat in their pack and then going off, and then that's what they would use to sleep on. So what the women would do is they would dye bulrushes different colors, and they would twist these designs into it, just like how you see here. So sometimes they would only use certain colors. So as you can see, we only have a certain number of colors. And they had primary colors, our ancestors, which were red, which is the color of life, blood, also the color of warfare, because that's what gets shed in warfare. Black, because when people suffer warfare and there's loss, they're in darkness. So they say it's black. There's white, which also represents peace, which would be the paradox, or the other side of war, peace and war. And then yellow, the color of the sun, because we refer to the sun culturally as our great elder brother, the big warrior. And we would have ceremonies in honor of the sun to ask him to bring us good luck in warfare. So in Seneca, that's what we say. We say Setwafji, which means he is our elder brother. And we say Andika Gakwa, which means the daytime sun. Bushkenigetaboa, the big warrior. So those were the primary colors that they would use. And so these bulrush mats are like reeds, and the women would pour boiling water over them, because you want to get rid of the things inside the plant, leaving behind just the fibrous like reed. And then that's when it becomes flexible after it dries, after you pick it. So the women would have this whole process set up in order to do that. And that's what the Seneca women and Haudenosaunee women would twist and twine. So what happens is that it becomes a symbol for warfare. So these men would carry them on their backs. So what happens though is that obviously it wasn't always just all out warfare. And what's happening is that instead of having this all-out bloodshed battle, you sit down and you have these moments of peace, and you have these talks in council, and you have these diplomatic meetings. So when you come to an agreement with each other, one of the things that we also made and utilized in our history is wampum. So the women also made something based on this mat. This mat represented warfare. They called it the war mat. But they also made mats of peace. They also made mats that were diplomatic. They weren't necessarily made from the bulrush mat. Can anybody guess what they might have been made out of? Wampum. They made wampum mats. So these represent warfare. They represented men going off, having something to sleep on, returning back to the village. It was the woman's extension outside the village, and it was represented her participation in the warfare, because men wouldn't leave the village without it. But women also made mats of wampum when they had to do something diplomatic. Thus, we have why this is not belt-shaped, it's mat-shaped. So it's not really a wampum belt, it's actually a wampum mat. So when we look at in here, in museum archaeology, if we look at how the women twisted the bulrushes together, and then we look at how they made these wampum belts, they used the same twisting action with cordage to make the wampum belts. So nowadays when people replicate these, they usually use a loom, and they kind of do it like how they do like beading. But that's not how the ancestors made those. The women made them, and the reason why the women made them is because they not only did they produce the war mats for the men, but they also had the technique down and the patience to sit and make the mats of peace, which are the wampum belts. So what they would do is all these leathers, they would cut out leather. Sometimes they would even use thicker cordages of tree fiber. And then what they would do is they would make a really thin cord from the same tree fibers. And what they would do is they would twist over the leather weft going this way, and every time they twisted the two together, that's when they would put a wampum bead on. Twist over the next leather weft, and over that twist is where you put a wampum bead. So they're twisting this cordage over the leather, and every time they twist, that's where they would put a wampum bead on. So when we look at these, that's what they are wampum mats. The extension of the women. We're a matrilineal society, but we also have women who stand up and rise to have voices of authority, and we call those clan mothers. So we're kind of, people say, people use the term matriarchy to describe our society, but it's actually like a balance between men and women. So matriarchy kind of, to me anyways, kind of implies that women have all the power, 100% of it. But they can't be, because women can't be on the battlefield making decisions and doing diplomatic missions there, away from the village. They can't do both. And the men just didn't have the time back in the day to say, all right, well, we're gonna have a diplomatic meeting with our warriors and your warriors, but let's take 3 months to go back to our village, ask our women what the decision should be, and then 3 months to come back and figure it out. So they had to have some kind of power given to the men to carry out such decisions. So it's a balance of equality, right? men and women both having voices of authority, which is why we have chiefs and why we have clan leaders. So when you look at these wampum belts, belt is a colonized term because it was the Europeans who first described them as belt shaped and belt looking, and then the term just kind of stuck. But that's what we identify it with. So when they established the Confederacy, the 5 nations came together, the peacemakers said, and this is where he kind of comes up with the ideas of using symbols to represent this newly formed union, right? So we have the tree of peace. Everybody can identify that. The white pine tree, the eagle that sits on top, the white roots of peace that extend outward in the 4 directions. So what he says to the people is he says, everybody will come and find shelter under the tree of peace. And those who wish to find their way there will trace the roots of the white roots of peace. So what most people don't really, kind of think of though is that the peacemaker also said, and you hear this in the Great Law when they read this wampum belt, is he says that your ancestors came up with the idea that a mat would be used to identify warfare. And he says you call it onodagete. But the peacemaker explains to the people that that was not conducive to peace and living in harmony amongst each other. So he says what we're going to do is we're going to wipe the mat and clean off the blood. So what happens is this metamorphosis comes. So onodagete changes and it becomes jonodagan gowa. So it has the same root, noda, which is the bulrush, because that's what the war mat was made out of. It has the suffix for describing the color. So in Seneca we say gagan, that means it's white. And we augment that, make it bigger or great, we say goa. So in Seneca, in all Iroquois languages, whenever you take something and make it into a specific name for something, you add another prefix to that. And the prefix that you add to it is what we call a repetitive prefix. So instead of saying onodagan goa, we add the repetitive, which is the S. The Y comes back on, and that S and Y make the J sound. And it becomes jonodagan goa, which means the great white bulrush mat. So this is the wampum belt that represents that, jonodagan goa. The metamorphic war mat that takes on a new identity, which is peace. So in the Great Law, they describe it. And there's the name of it. So whenever they install a new chief, if you've never been to a traditional condolence where they install a new sachem chief, a man will walk the length of the longhouse and he chants. And that chant is the roll call of all 50 sachem titles and their responsibility and also their relationships to each other. So it usually takes him about a good hour to do the whole chant back and forth. But in the chant, he names it and he says, Barodagan Gola, the great white man of the law. And that's where the term comes from, is onodagete, the term for warfare. So we don't really say onodagete today. This is a page from a Seneca dictionary that was written in the 17th century, so the 1600s, circa 1650s to about 1680, because that's when the Jesuits were in Seneca territories. We don't know which Jesuit wrote it. We can only guess maybe one of two. Julien Garnier, who was the head of the Seneca missions, or Jacques Bruyas. Jacques Brouillas wrote other dictionaries in other languages, but he also passes through Seneca territory for a short period of time. So he gives us this entry, Ondota, and it would have been pronounced at that time as Ondota. Ondota. So he gives us the French translation here, which is the word for mat. And then he also explains in here to go and get bulrushes. So when we say Ganoda, we don't hear that D in there. Otherwise it would be pronounced Gandoda, just like how it says in the entry. Well, the reason that D is in there in this Seneca dictionary is because the person that he was talking to and receiving the information from of the language was most likely a Huron, because that D is profound in Huron language. We also know that in the mid-1600s, there were 8 separate Huron villages living amongst the Seneca and the Genesee Valley. And that was the result of the Huron-Iroquois War of the early 1600s. So why aren't there any Hurons today? Well, because we married them all into Senecas. So none of us can really say we're 100% pure Seneca. And that's what really irks me when people say, well, we have to stay pure. We have to stay Seneca. But when we look at our history, we have Meskwaki, we have Huron, we have Erie, we have Neutral, we have Susquehannocks, we have Mississauga, we have Ojibwe, because we married in all those people. And we can even see it linguistically. So he says here, well, here's a word that he had heard based on the root word for bulrush. And that's what he writes is Ondodagete. He says here, warfare. So he says right here, Hudinodagete, the warriors in French. So one of the other things that can really give us a lot of information about the old culture, and when I say old culture, I mean like 1600s and before, are the Jesuit dictionaries. And part of the reason that is because when the Jesuits make their way to Seneca territory, we're still living without a whole lot of influence from Christianity, Catholicism, just yet. The only influences that are taking place at that time in Seneca territory is trade items. So one of the cool things and one of the most valuable things about Jesuit dictionaries is, they were written they were written by Jesuits, and we know that Jesuits were detrimental to the culture, but at the same time they did us a really big favor, because what they do is they write the language down that's being used at the time. So not only can we see the history of the change of the language, but we can also see words that had a different use at the time because we didn't have certain things yet. So especially the word for bread, right? So in Seneca we say ahwa for bread. But we didn't have loaves of bread, right, prior to European invasion. We didn't grow wheat, and we didn't have mills to mill it into flour. We had corn, we had cornbread. But the word aqua we don't use that for cornbread. We have another word for cornbread. And it doesn't even have the root word for corn in it. Aqua. So what did our ancestors say? How did they use it prior to wheat bread and grain bread? Well, the dictionary can help us and explain that to us. So when we look up the root word for aqua in the 17th century, what the Jesuit tells us is that the Seneca people were actually using the word aqua for prepared pumpkin. So what that means is that the ancestors at that time, and we already know that, so I can already see the look on some of your faces saying, well, I don't need a Jesuit to tell me that. But what it tells us is that it tells us that they were using and preparing pumpkin in such a way that they were using it almost like bread. Because why would you use that for bread, wheat bread, if it wasn't the same already? So that doesn't mean they were making sandwiches and having 2 pumpkins in there. No, they weren't doing it. What they were doing was they were cutting pumpkin into sections and they were drying it. But also they were preparing it. And what they would do is they would put something on top of it and then just eat it out of it like that. Because that's what he describes in the dictionary. And even at that time, it wasn't pronounced as eh. It was pronounced as ora. Because at one time Seneca had R's in it, and we don't have R's in it. And that's what we call phonological change. So if all of us spoke Seneca today, and we went back in time with a time machine, we would have a hard time understanding each other. That's how much the language changed. So museum archaeology, like we can have more insight into what he's writing down, and we can have more insight because we live the culture, we understand it. He doesn't, but he's recording the language for us. So I saw a hand up. Richie Kettle had his hand up. Can I answer your question?
One Sawane.
What's that?
One Sawane.
Well, it'd be Onyosawane. That's pumpkin. And it doesn't really even say pumpkin, it says big squash. So, here's something else that everybody can identify. This is a clay pot. And this clay pot is prehistoric. Its resting place now today rests in the Rochester Museum. This is one of only a few that were actually found intact. Because most pots, when archaeologists discovered them in the ground or even anywhere in nature, they were usually busted up, and they called those clay pot shards or sherds. But this one was found intact, and the reason why it was found intact is because it was found in a rock shelter, and that's where it was discovered by archaeologists. But it has the iconic shape, right? It has the crosshatch lines on the rim. It has kind of like this bottleneck and this really beautiful curved shape. And just by looking at it, you can already tell that it was made by a woman, because if a man made it, it would have rough edges, it would have angles, right? So it has a more curvier shape. But it's a very good representation of how we would identify a Haudenosaunee clay pot. So, one of the things though is that it's more than just a clay pot, and I'm going to explain a little bit in depth as to why that is. So I had already mentioned that Senecas would establish a village, right? And we kind of take for granted today that we're pretty much born and we die on the same territory, in the same place, in the same home even sometimes. But our ancient ancestors didn't have that luxury. They would be born in a village in one spot, and they would probably have to move about 3 or 4 times within their lifetime to new village sites. And can anybody guess why that is? So a typical Haudenosaunee village, prehistoric village, ancient village, would only last between 10 to 20 years, and then they'd have to move to a different spot. And they would have to move for different reasons, but there was one reason that stands out above all others. Can anybody guess what that might be?
Fertility of the land.
What's that?
Fertility of the land.
That's one reason, but it's not the main reason.
Firewood.
What is it?
Firewood.
Firewood. Very inquisitive. So firewood. Our ancestors didn't have iron bay axes. They didn't have wood splitters, and they didn't have chainsaws. So they didn't block firewood. They didn't log firewood from the forest like we can to feed our wood stoves. So what Haudenosaunee women and young people did was they went outside the village and picked up the dead wood that was laying on the ground, because it was ready to go. It was ready to burn, but it was also light to carry in bundles back to the village. So women weren't chopping wood out into the woods, carrying an armload of wood, half a mile back to the village. That's just not practical. But what they're doing is they're collecting the firewood off the floor of the forest and bringing that back. So after about 10 to 20 years, you're walking out because you've used up every bit that you could. So after about 10 to 20 years, you're literally walking out maybe 2 miles or so in this, diameter outside the village and then walking back. So it just gets impractical after a certain period of time. But planting grounds is a good point. It is true. You do exhaust the elements in the ground after you've planted so many seasons. Your animal population starts to dwindle. Your families are getting bigger. But one of the most important elements also that is essential to the village life is clay. So this is where women come in. So we know that women were making the clay pots. So let's say a time comes when the village's resources are just exhausted. You're not going to say, well, we can't live here anymore, so let's start looking for a new place to move next year. That's not practical. So you're already thinking ahead about 3 or 4 years about moving and looking for a new village site. So when you do find that perfect village site with lots of firewood, a huge grove of elm trees, because that's what's going to cover your longhouses, a huge grove of hickory trees, because that's what you're going to use for lashings. You see that it's got nice firewood, you have nice planting grounds, but there's one more element of the forest that is essential to the village and to sustain that village for the next 10 to 20 years, and that's clay. So that's where women come in and say to the chiefs, "You can't settle here. There's no clay." So this is where women, the source, one of the biggest sources of your authority comes from having clay. Because it was the women who came and said, we need a source of clay to sustain us here for this certain period of time. And as a chief who doesn't make any clay pots, he's not going to be the one to make that decision. He doesn't know. He hasn't spent his life doing that work. He spent his life outside the village. So what they do is they look for that source because it has to be there. So you're going to use the fresh clay out of the ground first. But that's not, infinite. So what you do is you have to start mining it. After a certain period of time, you have to start looking for it, like in the rocks and even the dried creek beds. So sometimes you don't have the luxury of getting clay out of the ground fresh and ready to go. Sometimes you have to process it. And this is where you see they're grinding it. So if you mine clay, let's say you see this nice rock shelf or this dried creek bed that's exposed, and you see dry, hard clay. Well, you take that, and it's not the elder women who have the knowledge to make the clay who's doing it. It's the young people who are helping them. The young women who are now in this period of time where they're working with the elder women. They're learning these things. So what happens is that you have to start, you pulverize it because you have to get out all the stuff that you don't want inside the clay. So we know that way with making clay pots, there's ratios from clay to your temper. So temper is what you add to the clay to make it stronger after you fire it. So we know that they were doing this. So young teenage girls don't have that knowledge to do that. It's the elder women who have spent their lives making clay pots. So whatever ratio they need of clay to temper, or even the amount to make certain size clay pots, it's the elder women who have that knowledge. So they're working with the young people, and you kind of have like this apprenticeship that's taking place. But the young girls aren't just learning where to identify clay, where to get it from. They're learning how to be responsible enough so that when they get to this point where they can make this, they're also responsible enough to make the decision and be able to sit down with the chiefs and say, we're gonna have our village site here. Or make bigger decisions for the family, or even make decisions for the nation as a whole, as clan leaders. So working clay and working with elder women, you get respect, you learn compassion, all the things necessary so that when it's your turn and you grow up, become big, you can be mentally capable of making those decisions yourself now, because you've taken over from the past generation. So that authority is strong in women, because you can't live without a clay pot. She can't eat without, hauling water and cooking. So therefore, he's not going to have that decision making. He's going to help and assist, but nonetheless, women get their authority from Mother Earth, which is what we've always said. But what happens when Europeans come? Well, they bring these brass pots, and they say to the Haudenosaunee women, these are going to make your life a whole lot easier. And they do. And they say, but if you want one, I want 10 furs. 10 furs is what it'll cost you. So what happens when you replace a clay pot with a brass pot? Well, it's like replacing your elder with a cell phone, right? You don't sit in the room with your great grandmother and learn language anymore, because now I can just look it up on my cell phone. You don't ask your elder a question about life, because now I can just pull out my cell phone and ask Google. Well, the same thing happens. So that authority that the women had when they settled into a new village, that was taken away, because now you don't need clay. Because we know by the 1650s, there's really nobody left alive that can remember, that were alive that made a clay pot. That's how fast it took place. So in Ganondagan, which was the capital of the Senecas at that time, we don't really see any clay pots in Ganondagan in archaeology. What we see are these. And we can even see the resin of decorating the rim, because some woman engraved this design around the top edge of the brass pot. But what it also introduces is that it also introduces the idea that, well, you're not going to be staying in the village anymore, because now you got to go out and help your husband get furs to get the clay pot, to get the brass pot. So if the women are absent from the village, now you have a change in how the dynamics work, how the families work. And this happens all throughout the whole village life. It's not just the clay pots and the brass pots. So another entry that we see in the Jesuit dictionary is he writes G-A glottal, T-A-R-A, which would be pronounced Gotdara. Gotdara. So he says this is the word that was being used for family. But what it really means is clay and birth. So he says, examples. 3, Yagwap Dalage, which means we are 3 families. Gayerli, which is 4. Today we say gay because there's no more R's. Nigatalagi, 4 families. And this is why they use the root word for clay for families. Why? Because it was the women who had the authority over the families. It was the women who produced the clay pots. It was the women who taught the younger women how to make clay pots, and in doing so, taught them how to become leaders, female leaders, having decisions and a say in the village. So at Tonawanda, we have a longhouse, and we have 4 clans on one side: turtle, wolf, beaver, and bear. And on the other side of the fire, we have hawk, we have heron, snipe, and we have heron. So whenever we divide like that for ceremonies at Tonawanda, we refer to the 4 animal side as we say, Gay Uditagay, which means they are the 4 clays, or as we can see, 4 families. On this other side, the bird side, Chief Corbett Sundown, who was a very, very knowledgeable elder, chief, faith keeper, he called this side Wis Hudidageno. So I said to my grandma, why is he calling it Wis? There's only 4 families there. She says, because we lost one. I said, well, which one was that? She says, I don't remember, because that was long before my time. Because when you say Wis, that's 5. When you say Hudi, it means it to them. When you say Dagay or Dalagay, that's the clay. And then you say the gay on the end, that means the number of them. So Wis Hudi Dagay. But then he adds a past tense suffix, which is the no. He says Wis Hudi Dagay no. And what that means is used to be 5 families or 5 clays, literally. Because the word for family is gawajiad. It's not, and it has nothing to do with clay. But we know our ancient ancestors, and even at Tonawanda, our elders used the word for clay to refer to family. That's why, because of the clay pot culture. So, what was the 5th clan? This is a drawing from 1666. It was drawn by a Frenchman, a French explorer traversing the northeast through Haudenosaunee territory. And as he's traversing, he's going in and out of the villages, he's going in and out of the forest, and inside the villages, inside the longhouses, he's seeing these symbols carved into the rafters or the beams of the longhouses. And when he's going out in the forest, he's seeing some of these other symbols carved into the trees or drawn onto the trees. So we know that that was a custom at one time for our ancestors to use hieroglyphic symbols on trees. So in this document, he actually explains each of the symbols and what they mean. So he says, these are the 4 clans. And that's what he says. He says Gayerli, and then he says Nigaksagi, or Nigaksagi, which means 4 clans. And he also says these are the 5 clans. He doesn't name the nation, but he gives us a clue that they're Seneca clans. And the clue that he gives us is he says that this one here, he calls it the family of the wild potato. He says is the family of the Genesee. There's only one Genesee River in Haudenosaunee territory, or even the northeast, and that's Seneca territory. So we know that based on the oral tradition, at Tonawanda, Chief Corbett Sundown, and other elders, there used to be 5 clans on that one side. But now we know from the document from 1666, there really was in fact a 5th clan in Seneca territory, and that was the Wild Potato Clan. Yes. Yes.
When I was doing genealogy, I was coming across Swan clan out there?
Swan clan?
Yes.
Sometimes the Swan clan can be referred to, like, you have to remember that, like, especially when things were written down, sometimes things were misinterpreted. And I've seen instances where swan was also used as a term to identify the heron.
In Onondaga, we still say the mud side, which is interesting, and we had a ball clan there too, which is a small pier.
So when you say the mud house, so they say that now, it means mud house, but the term that they use is the exact same term
That's
used
what
at
I was
Tonawanda.
thinking, I've never connected that.
So it's not really a mud house,
But that's in English.
it's the clans or the families that's
That's on that
used to
side.
describe the
Isn't
mud.
that neat though?
And the ball clan is actually, it's not a ball,
No, it was a small deer from what I heard.
it's a small species of deer.
Like the key deer size. It's
Yes.
almost an extinct species.
And what's the name of it, do you remember?
I don't remember. I just
So they
remember
call
when
it
it
the
ran.
wang-dog.
They described it when it ran, it would roll.
So in Onondaga, they call it the wang
They went down. That's
the
right.
wang
That's right. They still have a position there, but it's been empty for a while.
Yeah.
I'm gonna be nice.
So, a couple more things before it gets too late. So I'll just go through this really quick. This is a canoe with oars, paddles. The number of paddles tells us the number of men in the war party. They killed three deer on their endeavor. This is a warrior and what he looked like in the war party, a typical warrior. 3 people died on this endeavor, 2 males and 1 female. So their heads are cut off, they're upside down, which tells us that they're no longer living, that they perished. But we can also see the male and female identifications in the groin area. They took a prisoner, so we can see the prisoner with the gourd rattle, and he's wearing a prisoner collar made of moose hair that was also made by women. We see a council that took place between the bear and the beaver clan, because the bear is holding the wampum duck. So we see another council at the fire, the bear clan and the turtle clan, sitting together talking, hashing something out. So this was written in 1666. I saw the original in France back in 2022. We used it in a wampum exhibit that we had helped consult on there at the Museum des Quai Branly in Paris. So again, just really quick, we have the juxtaposition of a brass pot replacing the clay pot. And we kind of already explained the consequences and the erosion of the culture that happens when that takes place. The same thing happens. It was a role and responsibility of someone in the village to produce fish hooks from bones, right? That's generational knowledge that was handed down from one person to another for time immemorial. We don't know when. So they made from animal bones. We know from the archaeology exactly how they made them and the many processes it took just to get one fish hook. And what happens when you replace iron fish hooks, pre-made, ready to go? Well, the same thing happens that happened when you replace the clay pot with the brass pot. It replaced people. It replaced generational knowledge. It replaced the idea of sitting with somebody and learning not just how to make a fish hook, but you learn about them, who they are, your family history, and so on. So something as simple as a fish hook takes that away, and that's very unfortunate. So even the men, generational knowledge, spending time together, learning how to flint nap arrowheads. You can't live without arrowheads because we know that they were using them for hunting, providing for the families, right? You spend many hours with your uncle, your father, your grandfather, who earned that knowledge for himself already, but you learn about him, what he does, how he grew up, who he remembered, who taught him in those stories. But then what happens is they take the brass pot, they recycle it, and they start cutting arrowheads by the hundreds out of the brass pot, the outside of it. So what happens when you do that? Well, now you don't have to spend time with your grandpa because I can just cut an arrowhead out of a brass pot. No problem. Easy, ready to go. So now the respect for each other gets less and less. And when the respect for each other gets less and less, now you have more family quarrels, now you have more family separation, now you have the women leaders and the male leaders take over because the dynamic changes, because now more life is being spent by both men and women outside the village, hunting and trapping, in order to procure trade goods. Because it was the men who had most of the power outside the village, because that's where they spent most of their time. But now the women have to go with them, because now the dynamic has changed. Because now instead of being in the village, now you have to go outside the village, you have to hunt and trap, you have to help tan the furs. And it's, for a long time, women were making the trek from Seneca territory all the way over to Albany by themselves with loads of furs on their backs to trade for such goods. And rather than being in the village, raising a family, working together, now she's separated and has to take on a new way of life. So once again, this happens in many, many, many layers of the village until we come to the point now where we are just so removed from that old way of life, and add on top of that boarding schools that tell us you have to forget about that old way of life because it will no longer support you. I'm going to teach you how to have a job. I'm going to teach you how to make things so that you can get a job in a factory making. I'm going to teach you how to speak English so that you can listen to what your superior boss is going to tell you when you get a job. So you add that on to Christianity, you add that on to other influences, and now we have modern Seneca life. So with museum archaeology, we can reverse engineer culturally some of these things that we can no longer identify and tell stories about, using the oral tradition, the language, put all that together, and you get a good picture of what happens. So we know also that the whole reason in 1842 that we had the separation of governments between traditional and elected. Because with a traditional government, I'm a Turtle Clan member. There's a Bear Clan mother. And it's only up to the Bear Clan mother and those women who they raise up as Seneca Bear Clan chief. I have no say. But that chief can have a say and make decisions over the territory as a whole, meaning me also. So I have no say in raising him up, but now he's going to have authority and make decisions over me. That doesn't make sense, does it? It made sense in the ancient life because you had families, everybody understood and respected one another. But then when you take all that away, well then now you start to see the erosion of the culture, and that's one of the erosions that happens. And that's why the ancestors in this community decided that, well, if everybody's going to have an equal right in participation in government, well then we should vote and take the clan system out of it, because the clan system doesn't allow that. And it's true, because I live in Tonawanda, who retained the traditional chief system, and I do not have any authority as a man, and two, as a Turtle Clan member, as to who these other clans are going to stand up in their positions as chiefs, but they can make decisions as a whole council over the whole community, and I live in that community. So that's where we start to see, but it's not the people, it's the erosion, because at one time that system was working for the benefit of the people, but then what changes is the change in life and the way we have to adapt. And that's kind of like a small explanation into the deeper history of why the separation of governments. Because what happens is that you have chiefs, Turtle Clan chiefs, Bear Clan chiefs, Beaver Clan chiefs, who are off on their own making decisions. And what happens is at the end of the 1700s, start selling land. And they didn't even ask me. But the clan rather thought, well, this is my son who's Bear Clan, he's gonna make a good chief. But then goes outside the village, earns himself a reputation among non-natives, and then before you know it, he's signing something that says he's selling land. And I had no authority on whether or not she could put him up as a Bear Clan chief in the first place. So that's kind of how that happens. Yes.
Miss Julia Black Chief, was she a midwife?
Julia Black Chief, it was Julia Black Squirrel. You're talking about my
Black
great-
Squirrel.
Yes.
Was she a midwife?
I think a lot of women were midwives in that time period.
I was gonna say that name sounds familiar because she, delivered my father.
So Julia was actually married into a Black Squirrel. So she wasn't born and she didn't spend most of her. She
Well,
only married my
I
great.
recognize that name when you said that.
But that Black Squirrel name comes from Buffalo Creek also.
My grandfather's not from It's written.
Oh, okay, yes.
Your grandmother is a relative.
Yes.
So what's happening in repatriation at Rochester Museum?
Yes.
You know, is there anything happening in repatriation there, or?
So a lot of the ancestral remains that were excavated by archaeologists, all of the identifiable remains, and when I say identifiable, we know which nations they came from, and there's nations today who are still surviving that can claim those remains. So we have unassociated human remains at Rochester, and when I say unassociated, what I mean is that their ancestors, or their descendants are no longer living to claim them today. So we have neutral remains, but there's no neutrals today who can identify and according to the law say, well, I'm a federally recognized neutral, I'm gonna claim these remains. So we still have human remains, but what's happening now is that the museum is looking for the closest relatives of those nations who no longer live and are giving the remains back to them. That's in process right now.
Have claims been made
Yes.
and returned?
They haven't returned yet because the claim, when it goes into the federal registrar, has to stay there for 30 days. And the reason it has to be there for 30 days is so that somebody can make a counterclaim. Because maybe the Huron nation says, well, we buried in 80% of the neutrals, so they belong to us. But that rarely happens.
So what about like funerary goods and cultural goods?
So a lot of the funerary goods haven't been repatriated yet because nobody's made a claim.
I have a reference for you. I don't know if you've ever heard, but one of the earliest accounts of Iroquois is this guy left Fort Orange in 1634. He was from the Hudson Bay
Sure.
Company. It could have been possibly the Harmon Van Bogart.
Yes.
But I wrote it down. I'll have
So the
it.
term Haudenosaunee and the term Iroquois is actually in the Seneca dictionary.
You know what I mean, though. I'm
Yes.
just saying it's a good reference. 1634, they say, is one of the earliest before the Jesuit. I'll leave this with her.
Okay.
This is her mic.
Thank you. Is there any more questions before we kind of close up? Sure.
Referring back to the clans,
Yes.
Deer Clan and Killdeer Clan,
Yes.
which a deer is animal.
Yes.
How did he get on the bird side?
I can't tell you exactly how and when. All I can tell you is what I was told, and what the elders used to say is that when a deer jumps across the land, it looks like when you roll a ball and the ball goes like this. So they said, well, when he does that, it's almost as if the deer's feet never touches the ground because of how graceful he is. So he's included with the birds. That's all I ever really heard.
What does that comb mean?
I don't know what it means. I can only guess as to what it means. And the only guess that we can have, because the only person that really knows what it means is passed away. But just looking at the symbolism and thinking about the symbolism that I was taught in contemporary times, is that it could represent something of the Confederacy. So when they established the Confederacy, when you say keepers of the Western Door, they're not really referring to the whole Seneca Nation. What they're referring to is two Seneca sachem titles. Doni Hogatwe, which is Wolf Clan, and Gano Gitawi. In the Great Law, it describes these two men as being the keepers of that Western Door. Because in the Great Law, when they tell us when the Senecas joined, there were two factions of Senecas. Eastern Senecas and then the Western Senecas. And when they say east-west, it doesn't mean like this big huge gap in between. It was only a matter of a couple miles. The Eastern Senecas accepted the Great Law, but they did it reluctantly because they said, well, I'm not going to join because there's two Seneca guys over there who have a whole army behind them. And in retribution for accepting the Great Law, they might come over and kill us. So the peacemaker says, well, this is what we're trying to alleviate, because this happens all over the land, where you have these war leaders who are attacking smaller villages who want to accept the Great Law, because they have more political power and more forceful power on their own without the Great Law. So Shkenyo Dayo, that title, and his partner Satagalyes were the first two Seneca leaders to accept the Great Law. But they did it with the understanding that the peacemaker and the other nations would help them to get these other two guys to kind of come along and join. So when the peacemaker establishes the Confederacy, 48 sachem titles are brought forth. And they say, the peacemaker says to these 48 chiefs, this is the first item on your agenda. This is the first thing that you're going to counsel about as a Grand Council. And the first issue is, what are we going to do about the two Seneca war chiefs in the West? So they said, well, let's make a compromise with them. Because they're located where they're at, and because they do have a lot of political and they do have a lot of physical power, what we're going to do is if something comes to the Western Door, it'll be up to these two guys to look after them. So if any nation from the outside wants to counsel with the Grand Council, they have to come in through that Western Door, meaning it's up to the two doorkeepers to bring them to Grand Council by the hand. And if they don't, if they're threatening, then what they do is they lead them up by the hand over this mat. So again, there's that word mat, made of slippery elm. And what happens is that nation or individual slips on the slippery elm and falls into a heap of bones. That's symbolic, meaning that these two guys are gonna take care of it. So we have two doorkeepers of the Wolf Clan, Doni Hogatwe, the Senecas, and then there's a Wolf Clan title on the Eastern Door, the Mohawks. The peacemaker said the Mohawks, Onondagas, and Senecas are going to be related to each other as elder brothers. They're gonna sit on one side of the council. They're gonna hold up the rafters. And on the Seneca doorway, when they make it past Don't Evil Gatman, just inside, there's another title, Ganohkitawi. And Ganohkitawi is Snipe Clan. So if you look here, you'll see these little birds with these long beaks, which kind of looks to me like snipes. So that's what it could be a representation of. I don't know that for a fact, but based on the cultural knowledge of the Confederacy, that's what it looks like to me. So bone combs were important because not only they represent combing hair, when women suffered a death or a loss in her family, she would seclude herself for a whole year, which is where the 1 year feast comes from. But in that year, she wouldn't really partake in village life because she was in darkness. So at the end of the year, they would comb her hair because during that time, she would just let her hair just go. Sometimes they would even take hot embers from the fire and singe it. They would rub ashes in their hair. So at the end of the year, you can imagine what that would be like. So to help bring them and end the grief, they symbolically combed her hair, which still takes place even today. So usually when there's a widow, that's what they do. The man's family sits her down in the middle of the longhouse at the 10-day feast. At the very end, they comb her hair and they tie it up in ribbons. And they give her a gift and say, "We are thankful that you looked after our relative in marriage. So now your grief ends here today. We comb your hair, we give you a gift, and we send you on your way." So that's what bone combs represent. We know that they use them for Todadaho, to comb the snakes from his hair. So there's a lot of cultural significance other than just it being a comb that looks cool. So I can feel the hook on my neck going this way. And
I
I'm
don't
going
know
to
about
say
any
no.
of you, but I could listen to him for hours.
Right,
and hours.
yeah.
I don't even want to be right here, I'm gonna be sitting right there. But thank you so much,
Sure.
that was so rich, so thorough, I loved your explanations. And can we give him a hand, please? And just a reminder, we will be at the Powwow on Saturday, like I mentioned before, and don't forget about the movie tomorrow night down at Hollywood at 7:30.